Born into extreme wealth, she would give it all away, putting her on a path to sainthood.
Passion. There was a fire in her.
It's the awe-inspiring story of St. Catherine Drexel.
She was little but mighty.
And now her recent journey is bringing her spirit back to Philadelphia, with never-before-seen footage of her transfer to the Basilica Shrine. It's a special FYI Philly, St. Catherine Drexel, the Holy Heiress.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of FYI Philly.
We are at the Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway.
It is the new home of St. Catherine Drexel.
When she was canonized back in 2000, she became just the second American-born saint.
As a woman born into high society, she was fully expected to live a lavish life of privilege.
But instead, she shocked her family and the world, dedicating her life and her entire fortune to serving society's most oppressed. The Drexel family legacy is vast. Catherine Drexel's father, Frank, helped fund the construction of the Cathedral Basilica and is said to have donated the copper for the roof. Her uncle Anthony founded Drexel University. And Catherine started schools throughout the country committed to educating Native American and African American students.
The people considered not worthy of anyone's attention.
And she founded her own religious order to do the work, both risky and groundbreaking for its time in the late 1800s.
She really believed all people should have the best education and no one should be different from someone else.
The money for Catherine's largesse had come from her grandfather, Francis Drexel. A struggling portrait artist, he'd emigrated to America from Austria in 1817 and set up shop on South Front Street.
He intended to make a fortune. That's what he said in his diary when he came here.
In Philadelphia, he didn't do all that well, so he traveled. And by doing that, he learned a little bit about money changing.
That knowledge became opportunity with the Panic of 1837, as banks failed and the nation plunged into a major recession.
As a trader in currency, you could make a fortune, so that's what he started to do.
And before you know it, he was a very rich man.
His 11 and 13-year-old sons, Anthony and Frank, became his apprentices, working and sleeping under the counter of their shop near 3rd and Market Streets, as their father quickly built what would become one of the greatest banking fortunes in American history.
Even before Catherine was born, her family was engaged in works of charity.
They felt that their money was only given to them to share, to do good works.
Catherine was born November 26, 1858, in a long-since razed row home on the 400 block of Ray Street, and baptized at the Church of the Assumption at 12th and Spring Garden.
This is the font in which St. Catherine Drexel was baptized. The 8 sides symbolize eternity. Even though she would not have known it, that was the beginning of her eternal life.
But as she was receiving her first sacrament, her mother lay dying.
Her father fell into absolutely debilitating grief.
Catherine and her older sister Elizabeth were sent to live with their uncle Anthony in a palatial mansion that covered the entire 3800 block of Walnut Street in West Philadelphia.
Anthony Drexel, if you go to Drexel University, looks very stern and forbidding. And in fact, he was not. He loved reading aloud to the kids. They did amateur theatrics. They recited poetry.
When Catherine was 2, her father remarried and the family reunited, taking up residence in Center City, just a few blocks from Rittenhouse Square.
His second wife, Emma Bouvier, was very religious.
They had an oratory in the house, which was exceptional.
She was watching her father come home from work and pray for a half hour and then play his organ.
He loved to play the organ. He played every day.
A prosperous banker by trade, but a pious artist at heart, her father would walk 12 miles round trip to play the organ at St. John's Church in Manayunk on Sundays.
Her stepmother and her father instilled in their children that even though they were quite wealthy, they had a social responsibility.
Frank was generous with established institutions, but Emma practiced philanthropy on a very personal level.
She would dispense charity from her house.
She invited the children to be very much a part of that. In fact, they opened up their home one day a week.
Her mother used to hire a woman, much like a social worker would be today, because they wanted the money to go to the really poor.
She said, never let the poor have cold feet.
She had hundreds of people that she was helping.
So they learned at a very young age that they were blessed and they had to share that blessing with others.
But still, few would have predicted the young Katie would choose the religious life.
She liked very fancy things. If she wanted something from her mother, she would plead for it in these writings.
She was a typical little girl. When Catherine was just a toddler and Louise was born, she would sometimes go over, poke Louise just to see her cry.
With the birth of Louise, there were now 3 Drexel sisters, and they lived the life of the elite with in-home tutors.
Not just any tutors. They might have a doctor to teach them about anatomy. University professors would be hired to teach these children.
They took trips abroad to Europe, had a summer estate in Torresdale, and Catherine loved to go down the shore.
She was very feisty. She loved teasing people, and she was an incredible flirt.
She made her formal debut into society, entertained at least 1 marriage proposal, and the expectations for a woman of her status were quite clear.
Marry well, be a lady of society who was also charitable.
But it never entered her mind that her vocation was to the consecrated life.
But as she was outwardly living the life of a grand lady, she was also keeping a top-secret journal she called the Holy Spirit Speaking to My Soul.
She was wrestling with what God was calling her to do. And if there are people who are in poverty and starving, then what am I doing here?
A series of personal tragedies and a face-to-face meeting with the Pope would help the young Catherine Drexel answer that question.
Our life is short. What happens here is trivial. It's the eternity afterwards that matters.
That part of the story when this special edition of FYI Philly comes right back.
St. Catherine Drexel, the Holy Heiress, is presented by the Connolly Foundation with additional support from the Knights of Columbus.
Welcome back to the special FYI Philly, Catherine Drexel, the Holy Heiress.
We are at the Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul, the new home for St. Catherine's Shrine.
Growing up a child of privilege, no one would have guessed she would one day be a nun, much less a saint.
She was, by all accounts, a typical teenager, flirty, and a bit vain.
But she also had a serious side, and she was extremely devout.
And she struggled to understand how she could want for nothing in a world where there was so much need.
Like many children, Catherine Drexel and her sisters started receiving an allowance once they reached a certain age.
A couple $100s a month at that time was a very large sum. And one of the first things she did was supply a statue to one of the Indian missions.
She learned that from her mother, that it's about giving away what other people need to have.
Her stepmother, Emma, died in 1883 after a battle with breast cancer.
Her father really never recovered from his wife's death.
And it was at that point that Catherine started telling Bishop Joseph O'Connor that she wanted to be a nun.
He was like her spiritual director and very close to the family.
Before being named Bishop of Omaha, O'Connor had been the priest of St. Dominic's Church near the family's summer home in Torresdale.
He did not seem to favor her going into the convent.
She said, "No, I'm called to do this," and he said, "Absolutely, you're not."
Bishop O'Connor argued her money would be better spent as a charitable lady of society. And 2 years later, when Catherine's father died, she and her sisters were suddenly staggeringly rich, with an estate valued at nearly $16 million.
She could have done anything she wanted to do.
Her father left 10% of his fortune to charity and split the remainder among his 3 daughters with built-in protections against fortune hunters posing as suitors.
As long as the 3 girls lived, they received $1,000 a day on the interest of the money, and that's how they did their work.
All 3 shared a devotion to the needs of African Americans. Catherine was moved by the plight of Native Americans as well.
Remember, this is the time of the great massacres, the genocide of the Native American people.
The sisters donated an altar in memory of their parents to the Cathedral Basilica and founded an industrial training school for orphan boys in Eddington, named for their father.
I went through St. Francis Vocational School. I had several brothers that went through it also.
But Catherine was devastated by the loss of her father.
She fell apart. She was in despair.
So the sisters took a trip to Europe to help Catherine get over her grief. While there, she had a meeting with Pope Leo XIII that would change the course of her life.
She had already started her work supporting the Indian missions.
She was pleading with the Holy Father to somehow make priests available.
And he said to her, "Well, why not yourself be a missionary?"
Bishop O'Connor, originally resistant, not only agreed, he insisted she start her own religious order, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, with a focus on society's most oppressed.
It was very obvious to her that people saw a major difference because of skin colors.
Because she was so famous in Philadelphia, she was sent to the Sisters of Mercy in Pittsburgh for her novitiate.
She could have given her money, and that would have been wonderful, but she literally gave away herself.
It was a hard life. She gave up everything. and she'd been raised with absolutely everything.
The mother house in Ben Salem was built in the Spanish mission style, and Catherine kept up a steady flow of funds to schools and parishes in the West.
When you hear someone having billions of dollars, in personal finance, you say to yourself, well, what do you do with all that money? And Catherine would say, here are the needs. Do this, this, and this.
For African Americans, she built Holy Providence boarding school on the grounds of the mother house.
4 generations of my family went to school here.
And she opened missions and schools throughout the segregated South.
The idea that you were starting a school for blacks, number one, not my neighborhood, and number two, don't educate them.
She never let anything stop her from doing anything what she knew what was right.
She used straw buyers to purchase new properties.
She couldn't buy it in her own name. They wouldn't sell it to her if they knew that's what it was going to be used for.
One of her schools in Beaumont, East Texas, the KKK posted the school threatening to burn it down.
Her aim was evangelization and education.
Saving souls is part and parcel of social justice.
She created Rock Castle, a boarding school for girls on a former slave plantation in Virginia.
But her jewel was Xavier University in New Orleans.
It's the country's only historically black Catholic university, and among HBCUs, it ranks among the top in graduates who go on to careers in medicine, the sciences, and judgeships. And on its construction, Mother Catherine spared no expense.
Xavier, she wanted to be built out of Indiana limestone.
Because, she said, the students there should have the best, but she took her own vow of poverty very seriously.
She would actually take the pencils away from the students, give them new pencils, and use their used pencils. Her shoes had holes in them.
Multi-millions of dollars of money in the family, but she wanted to be as poor as she could be.
But she was always a banker's daughter.
She knew how to get things done, and she knew how to handle money.
She would have been able to tell you exactly how many schools, how many students, how much everything cost.
And she was a hands-on hard worker.
She was constantly visiting her missions throughout the country. She would open up new missions personally.
This woman never slowed down. She never stopped.
She set a high bar for all of us. Now we don't all make it, but she gave her total gift of self.
When she wasn't adding schools and missions, she was working in other ways, lobbying newspapers to stop identifying the race of African American suspects and partnering with the NAACP to push for anti-lynching legislation.
She was little but mighty.
There was a fire in her, and we need people on fire like this today.
For St. Catherine's Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, the mission continues. After teaching students in rural Louisiana and Harlem, New York, Sister Lynn Marie Ralph is now Director of Education at St. Martin de Porres in North Philadelphia.
Mass is at 10 o'clock every Sunday, and I promise you, you will be blessed.
Sister Donna Breslin helped start a Meals on Wheels for seniors in Louisiana, served the Puebla people in New Mexico, and ministered for 12 life-changing years in Haiti.
We had many children who were malnourished when we first came down there. And after 4 or 5 years, people in the community would say, our children used to go to the cemetery, but now they go to school.
I just returned from Jamaica.
Sister Faith Okerson taught in Atlanta during the Civil Rights era, then went to St. Ignatius in West Philadelphia, one of 4 historically black parishes in Philadelphia.
All 4 were heavily funded by the Drexels.
She and the sisters mean so much to me.
Dr. Trudy Brown went to school at Holy Providence.
Here I am at 25 with my grandmother.
Her grandmother, Julia, was among the first students when the school first opened in 1892.
Whatever accomplishments I've made in my life, it's been because of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. And I feel so blessed. This is history.
Even before Catherine's death in 1955 at the age of 96, the calls for canonization had already begun.
It was almost like you were in a dream.
We travel her road to sainthood when this special episode of FYI Philly comes right back.
Welcome back to this special FYI Philly, St. Catherine Drexel, the Holy Heiress.
It is, of course, fitting that we celebrate her life and legacy in the month of March.
It's Women's History Month, and it's also the month she died back in 1955.
And while the path to sainthood often lasts centuries, in Catherine Drexel's case, it would take just 45 years for canonization. The funeral mass for Catherine Drexel was held here at the Cathedral Basilica, just like her beloved father's and her stepmother's had been. And the pews were packed.
At her funeral, there was even the bishop who preached it said, well, someday she'll be a saint.
With hundreds of nuns ministering in schools and parishes across the country, the impact of her life's work is immeasurable.
Oh, thousands. Thousands.
I mean, it goes on and on, the list of benefactors.
Cardinal John Kroll officially opened the cause for her canonization in 1964 after the Archdiocese proved to Rome that Mother Catherine had what is considered a cult.
Cult doesn't mean anything fanatic.
In the Catholic faith, it simply means that there's a sense that Catherine was so remarkably holy in the way she lived her life that she is, in fact, a saint in heaven.
So they begin to ask her favors. They praise God through her.
That's what the family of Bob Gutherman did.
They were praying the pain would go away, or at least I'd be able to tolerate the pain.
The Bucks County man grew up near the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. When he was 14 years old, he suffered a devastating ear infection.
2 of the bones in my right ear were completely destroyed by this infection. There was nerve damage, there was tissue damage.
Damage his doctors insisted could not be repaired.
That I would never again hear out of my right ear.
So his family began praying to Mother Catherine for a cure.
I come from a very big family. I'm one of 11 children. The main focus around our house growing up was you had to be home for dinner, and you didn't get up from the dinner table until after the rosary is said.
His doctor soon discovered that Gutherman's body was healing itself.
He said, if this body keeps progressing the way it is, he said, I'll never have to touch this boy again. And he never did.
The church spent 14 years investigating, trying to rule out any medical explanation.
I would get a phone call. Go see this doctor, get this test done. We weren't allowed to talk about it.
Then, in 1988, Gutherman got a call saying Rome had approved the miracle.
At that point, I was 28 years old. Now I'm on the 6 o'clock news.
And Catherine Drexel would be beatified at the Vatican.
The beatification was an amazing thing because it happened so quickly. No one expected it, and all of a sudden it was happening to us.
She was now just one miracle away from becoming a saint, and that second miracle would also come from Bucks County.
Amy Wall. And again, she was a miracle hearing. She was profoundly deaf.
When the toddler's family heard that Bob Gutherman's hearing was miraculously restored, they started praying to Mother Catherine to also heal their daughter.
And all of a sudden, she started to hear.
Mother Catherine became St. Catherine on a rainy October 1st, 2000 in St. Peter's Square.
We all went to Rome, and it was so packed. You saw nothing but different colors of umbrellas. And I think that's such a beautiful picture. It's uniting us all.
And then when the Pope announced her name, the skies just cleared.
She chose to give not just her fortune, but her whole life.
It was the most memorable thing that's ever happened to my life.
It was almost like you were in a dream. It was like, this is really happening, that our foundress, St. Catherine, is a saint.
Canonization was the culmination of something really quite magical in that her life had touched so many people.
She didn't see rich people and poor people. She saw the totality of God's child and all.
And while it's hard to say why both of her miracles involved hearing, there are some theories.
Catherine Drexel's message, I believe, was one of listening.
We're supposed to be hearing the cries of those in need around us all the time.
And just be open to great possibilities of what can be done.
And it's hoped that her life story will serve as a message of hope and inspiration.
That we can all live like St. Catherine and work to make a world a more accepting and loving place.
When she died in 1955, the money stopped.
Her move from the Mother House to the Cathedral when our special St. Catherine Drexel, the Holy Heiress, comes right back.
This special FYI Philly St. Catherine Drexel, the Holy Heiress, is presented by the Connolly Foundation, with additional support from the Knights of Columbus.
Welcome back once again to the Cathedral Basilica of St. Peter and Paul right here on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway.
The new home of St. Catherine Drexel, a woman born into wealth who chose to live a life of poverty.
Her mission? To save souls and make the world a more racially and socially just place.
And it's hoped that now that she's here in the center of the city, more people will hear her story and be inspired.
Welcome to the Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul.
The Archdiocese held a special Mass November 18th to celebrate the installation of St. Catherine's tomb.
It was almost like we were experiencing, to a certain degree, a second canonization Mass.
The pews were filled with people whose lives had been touched by St. Catherine and the work of her Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament.
It was so crowded, and I mean, you had people from all over.
Her sarcophagus had been quietly and carefully disassembled at the Mother House in Bensalem. Her sacred remains then transferred to the cathedral in early August, where the tomb was reassembled.
We had studies that gave us clear indications of what would be necessary to do just that.
The sisters had requested the move. The foundress's fortune had run out.
When she died in 1955, the money stopped.
In writing his will, her father had been trying to protect his daughters from being taken advantage of.
They could only spend the interest. They could never touch the principal.
When they died, the money would go to their children, not their husbands. But none of the Drexel sisters had heirs, so the estate went to charities her father had designated, and Catherine had not created any sort of endowment.
She thought, God gave me this money, it's my job to give it to the poor.
I think she felt the money would always be there. It always had been there for her.
For the sisters, the move has brought a sense of sadness and loss.
It's like someone that you love and have been with so closely leaves.
But there's also gratitude.
The woman who saw herself and her daughters as part of the church is actually in the cathedral. I think that's awesome.
Her shrine is set up at the back of the cathedral.
It was fitting that if the saint was no longer going to be interred in the Mother House, this was the place where it should be.
It looks exactly like when it was here at the Mother House. I mean, it's outstanding.
It sits right beside the altar she and her sisters donated as a memorial to their parents, and not far from the altar of Archbishop Patrick Ryan. He served as Catherine's close advisor in the early days of her ministry.
We called him our Father in God.
Happy Feast of St. Catherine Drexel. We love her.
At the Mass to celebrate her feast day on March 3rd, St. Catherine once again proved she can pack the pews.
I do believe that many, many more people will come to know about St. Catherine by her presence now at the cathedral.
And it's hoped that here, in this central location, she can serve as a role model for all.
Don't live in such a self-centered, self-motivated way.
She was not at all materialistic, and she did not have prejudice. I think the two greatest sins of our country.
There is such a need to love one another, to trust one another, and to respect people.
Since St. Catherine was moved here, the Archdiocese has seen a steep increase in the number of pilgrims coming to pray at her tomb.
And for that reason, it's just been named an Archdiocesan shrine, with the hopes that it will soon be designated a national shrine.
That will draw even more ceremony and attention to her story and the lessons of her life.
Well, if you'd like to visit, the cathedral is open every day and welcomes everyone. We hope you found Catherine Drexel's story as inspiring as we have.
Thanks for joining us.